Hey guys, we just finished an amazing podcast with an amazing doctor. We had a lot of fun. I just want to make a little disclaimer before you go into the video. Go into it with an open mind. Everything that he says is super interesting. He's a very fascinating and very intelligent guy. He's taught very many high-level PhD students, people that we read about, that translate Bibles, that talk about theology, philosophy, all this kind of stuff. But go into it with an open mind. I don't believe everything that was taught in the video or that he talked about in the video. Ethan disagrees with certain things, I disagree with certain things, but we're all learning and we're all on this journey of understanding the Bible, right? And what it's really supposed to mean. So I'm studying the things that were talked about in the podcast. Ethan's still studying it. You should go into it with an open mind, listening and trying to gain as much knowledge as you can. It's awesome. Let us know what you think about it and get ready for an awesome episode.
Enjoy. Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the Things You Don't Hear in Church podcast. My name is Ethan.
And my name's Derry. And today we have a very special guest named Thorsten Moritz. He's a professor. He's published work, academic work. He's traveled the world and he's taught all around the world. And he's started something called Prohibition Theology, really interesting YouTube and TikTok channels where he's going over a lot of the things that the church hasn't talked about a lot in the past, a lot of things that institutions like seminaries have avoided in the past as well. I've loved his work so far, and he's come on today to talk about some really interesting stuff. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to meet you guys.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you right off the bat, I was looking up your credentials and I couldn't find out what you are a doctor in.
Okay.
Can you share with us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I'm a doctor in it's a mix of hermeneutics and New Testament. And hermeneutics can mean one of two things. For some people, it just means how to interpret the Bible. I think that's a big mistake. I think the idea has to be, how do humans interpret, period? You know, not depending on what it is you interpret. And so that kind of hermeneutics is interdisciplinary. You got to know stuff about anthropology or history, sociology, theology, philosophy, anything that ends with ology or something like that. You got to know it. And hermeneutics is like that hub. If you imagine a sort of an old, you know, like on the Wells Fargo logo or whatever, an old wheel with a hub and the spokes. Hermeneutics is the hub, and everything that ends with ology are the spokes. So that's kind of what my doctorate is in, but also New Testament. So I'm kind of both. I'm a sort of philosophical guy as well as a New Testament guy.
Very cool.
By philosophical, I mean critical thinking.
Okay. And then how many years have you been holding your doctorate or been studying hermeneutics and New Testament?
Oh, many years. I'm an old dude. So let me see. I did my PhD in England, London/Cambridge, and I started very early. So I was done when I was 26. So basically I've been doing this for about 30 years.
That's awesome. Wow.
So yeah, definitely someone that we can glean information from and learn from and has some sense of authority in this topic of hermeneutics.
Just a little bit.
And the topic we're going to get into, you know, just a lot of authority there.
That's awesome. One thing that I really liked about your YouTube channels and stuff like that I kind of mentioned at the beginning, and maybe we could talk a little bit more about like your endeavors with Prohibition Theology, was really trying to bring those topics that have been avoided to the forefront. Do you want to talk about your mission at all with creating that platform?
The YouTube one, or
just your brand of Prohibition Theology?
Well, yes. Okay. So I'm a guy who, because of my hermeneutical emphasis, I'd like to think of myself as someone who can work in all kinds of different theological environments, but also in non-theological environments. So professional development, for instance, in the corporate world or whatever. I very firmly believe, and your question kind of ties into that. I firmly believe that if you're going to be doing well at stuff like theology and biblical interpretation, it has to be in tune with what it means to be truly human, right? Not perfect, but truly human. Truly human means not perfect, but still it needs to be good, right? And so the whole idea that sometimes someone like me ends up working in an environment, whether it's a seminary, more liberal or more conservative or whatever, where you have to fit certain frameworks, which frankly I never did. But if you work in that kind of environment, eventually that comes a point where you basically say, hey, the only reason I'm still tolerated here is as someone who doesn't care so much about the institution at all, but who cares about us as human beings, the only reason I'm tolerated in institutions, whether it's seminaries or speaking at churches or whatever, where you where you sort of say these things and people might get a little uncomfortable, is when your events are full and your classes are full. And mine were always full, and I never canceled any. But that meant still that anything I had to say, anything that was a little bit provocative, anything that wasn't just towing the line, the institutional line, the doctrinal line, or some other line, anything that wasn't quite that, I could speak freely, but it was only ever sort of in the classroom. And sometimes students felt like, why do we, if we want to talk to you about this stuff some more, it almost feels like we have to go off campus, some coffee shop, And I spent countless hours in Starbucks talking with students who say, hey, can we talk about this? Can we talk about that? All came out of the classroom. So eventually I thought, why not take this on a sort of social media platform? And that's how it came about.
That's awesome.
Cool.
Wow.
What's one of the subjects that students had the most questions about, or the most repeated question that you received from your years of
that they were like scared to talk about?
Okay. I got to make sure I'm not going to use the next 30 minutes to answer that. All right. So I'll just randomly, in no particular order here. I do not believe, for instance, that there is a biblical basis for institutional church as such. Yet I was hired for years by institutions.
Right.
But I've always been upfront about this. Always, I said, listen, if you want me to say certain things, I won't. So this is one example for you. What Jesus did to the institution in the first century, and that ultimately, meant that he died on the cross. Surely we have to account for that. I mean, it would be silly to then go back to that institutional thing as if nothing had happened. I mean, why did he die if not to create a new kind of humanity that was deeply decentralized? Okay, so that blew a lot of students' minds because I mean, it's very easy to demonstrate this from the Bible. If you take a hermeneutical approach, but students are saying initially, wait, I'm at a seminary and my prof is telling me that. So that's an example.
When you say Christian institution, do you mean like the church on Sunday morning, or like Christian schools as well, and like a Christian?
I'm mostly thinking church and churches as institutions, and then the sort of the para-church organizations, the tentacles. And I mean, if you look at Judaism at the time of Jesus, and he doesn't run with any of this, of it. And you have in Judaism, you have pilgrimages, you have centralized understandings of holiness. You have holy places, you have holy times, you have holy offices, you have rituals, you have purity laws, you have food laws, you have a concentric view of the circle that eventually has Israel kind of bubble up to the top. And Jesus blows all of that comprehensively out of the water, which is why his disciples didn't like him very much for that. I don't know if you've ever noticed, like you go to Mark's gospel, and frankly, any of them, you go to the gospels, they're awful. They are so bad. Why are they so bad? I mean, in Mark's gospel, I think they get about 3 things right. They follow him.
Disciples,
they pick up the donkey, and what else they do? They find the upper room. Apart from that, I cannot for the life of me think of a single instance where they get anything right. And what's the reason for that? The reason is that he blew the thing apart that they were committed to and remained committed to in Acts. So then the Holy Spirit in Acts takes others who are willing to move past the institution and infiltrates the Roman Empire through them, the no-names, not the disciples, not the 12. The only one who still hangs around a little bit after Acts 6, you ever notice this? The only one is Peter, and only because he gets
Yeah.
dragged out there kicking and screaming by the Holy Spirit, Acts 10, Acts 11, and so on.
Yeah.
We have to account for this stuff. We can't say, oh, we're biblical, and then we go kind of right back to, as if to a way of doing this humanity thing, as if Jesus had never happened.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. I feel like there's so many questions I'd love to ask you in regarding that one subject, because one of my passions is like how we do church in the West, right? And like institutionalized as well. And I have some opinions, but maybe we'll have to have you on for another episode because we got another topic that'll take a lot of time to get into.
So today we'd love to talk to you about your view of the rapture, eschatology a little bit. It's been very popular on the internet lately. A lot of people having very intense discussions and debates over what's true, what's not true, different sides of the subject, very heated on a lot of different fronts. And you made a good series of videos about it. So we wanted to have you on to talk a little bit about it, maybe where it came from, like kind of what it is today and what the Bible originally meant from your view of all this rapture theology.
So in terms of where it came from, I mean, that one's relatively simple. It's not entirely clear, but clear enough. A lot of people say it came from about 1830, which is more or less true. And then some 1830, okay? So that's 1800 years after Jesus. And people can kind of Google what happened in 1830. And some say, but
John
wait,
Darby,
there
right?
was, say that again?
That was John Darby, right?
Yeah. And then some people say, but wait, something happened along these lines a few centuries earlier or whatever. I personally can't get too excited about that. I mean, it has certainly no roots in the New Testament. But once it took roots in Christian theology, people, and this is so classic, personally drives me crazy, but because I'm into hermeneutics, which is about taking the other seriously, in this case, the text, then the classic thing happens. Once you say, whoa, this whole theology thing that my church taught me, or my pastor, or my youth pastor, or something, surely that's in the Bible. And then you go and way to go, you find it, right? Confirmation bias, you're going to find it. If you're convinced it's there, you're going to find it, except that you can't find it because it's not there. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I mean, you will find it because of confirmation bias, not because it's actually there.
It'll be a deductive study rather than an inductive study.
So if you go, for instance, to Mark 13, which many call an end time passage, and then there's a parallel in Luke 21 and in Matthew 24 and 25, and then in Luke you have also Luke 17 and a little bit in Luke 13, and you have all those passages, and you have 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5 and so on. If you look at those, something that I find really intriguing is that as those texts kind of oscillate between the literal and the metaphorical, if you then look at what commentators who believe in rapture theology, what they do with that, they're inversely related to what the text is actually doing. Evangelicals in particular seem to have a hermeneutical death wish. If you go to Mark 13, there's a lot of metaphorical stuff there. And we can show it very clearly because a lot of it comes from the book of Isaiah. And in Isaiah, everybody agrees this is metaphorical. But then somehow when Jesus uses it in Mark, supposedly it's no longer. But anyway, that's another one of those inconsistency. But if you look at that, the metaphorical stuff gets interpreted literally by those people who need to find a rapture somewhere. And the stuff that is literal, that talks about, for instance, I give you guys an example and then people can look it up and, and don't have to take my word for it. So when the disciples ask him, when will this happen? This awful thing that you're talking about here, destruction of Jerusalem. They ask him that as one or two questions at the beginning there of the discourse in Mark 13. And then he answers that. And at the end, he sums it up and he says, it'll happen within a generation. Guess what? The evangelicals who want to literalize the metaphorical, they will suddenly treat that literal statement metaphorically. It makes no sense.
Yeah, that was one of the things that confused me for a long time growing up until I inductively studied Matthew last year, and I was like, and I think this is right, but correct me if I'm wrong. It's about the fall of Jerusalem when he's like,
Exactly. It's entirely Mark 13 in its entirety is about the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And if you look at something like Luke 17, where, they ask him about the coming of the Son of Man, which, by the way, in the Old Testament, a phrase that it's used a lot in Ezekiel, but Jesus mostly uses it on the basis of Daniel. If you look at that in the Old Testament, in Daniel 7, it's clearly a phrase for Israel. Okay. It's clearly the holy ones, plural, 3 times in the chapter. There's no question about it. But again, evangelical Christians tend to then look at that in the New Testament and say, no, this must just be about Jesus. Well, the answer is that Jesus uses Israel terminology, applies it to himself, thereby claiming that the thing that Israel failed to achieve over the centuries, which is to live sacrificially for the sake of the world, he will do that even if it takes him to the cross. Wow. Now, of course, the disciples already don't like that.
Yeah.
Is this what we gave everything up for? That's it, Jesus?
Yeah.
And then they talk about the coming of the Son of Man, which from Jesus's perspective means that Israel's vision is finally coming to fruition, but in him. He's the real Israel and those who commit to him. Now, the question, of course, is for the disciples, wait, so if we're going to commit to him, we kind of already have, but when we didn't know that this was the deal. And lo and behold, you go to the second half of the Gospels, which is Acts. It's part of the same book as Luke, just the second volume. You go there, and the disciples have almost nothing to contribute, except at the beginning in Jerusalem, when ironically Jesus had actually told them to get the heck out of there. And they said, no, thank you. And they stayed. But the Spirit goes out of there and then takes all these no names. I actually have a T-shirt. Some people in Hawaii actually are wearing those because I took some out there because they wanted it, where somebody took my initials TM, which could also mean trademark. And they took one of the phrases that I use a lot in class, which is minor characters, who are really the big characters in the gospel. So I have minor characters, TM. And in your part of the world, there are quite a bunch of those.
That's pretty cool. I like that shirt idea. Yeah.
It's the minor characters. Now back to the rapture then. So in Luke 17, when they're saying, basically they want to say, are you kidding here? The disciples. And then he uses sometimes a singular, Son of Man, and sometimes he uses the plural and actually that plural thing happens more often in the Old Testament, the holy ones. But what's interesting in Luke 17 is when Jesus talks about this, he talks about the day and the days, singular and plural, and it's very clear that the days are the run up to AD 70. It's a Jewish war from AD 66 through 70. For first century reader, that is pretty straightforward. And then the day is the culmination. Which is the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jesus wasn't kidding when he said this stuff is going to happen within a generation. But like I said, evangelicals have a propensity to make the literal metaphorical and the metaphorical literal, and they do it. And I grew up an evangelical, by the way, and they do it because they've already made up their mind that whatever their church taught them must be true. Now we're going to find it in the Bible, come what may.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So if the rapture isn't a reality of like we're going to be magically disappeared, like Left Behind series talks about, then what is your view of what the Bible teaches? What would be the reality of what that is then?
So the Bible has very, very little interest in speculating about the end of the world. And the reason it has very little interest is because it consistently considers creation to be good.
Right.
With problems, but good. I mean, you read Genesis, good, right? Every day, good. Throughout, whether it's the Psalms or the prophets, the poetic literature in the Old Testament, creation, everything everything is the Lord's as far as creation.
Right. Right.
So this rapture idea that somehow has us being evacuated from here and we go 3.75 billion light years that way, and then we turn right at the stoplight, it just makes no sense in terms of the worldview of the Bible. And we can test this. We can test it very clearly. So for instance, Mark 13 again, there's language there that looks apocalyptic, otherworldly, transcendent, like rapture language. But we know from Josephus, the historian in the first century, very clearly, and from Maccabees, the Maccabean literature, which you can find in the in Catholic versions of the Bible. We know from that very clearly that that kind of language, like the end of the world, or the worst woes that have ever been experienced in creation, that kind of language was applied very much to an event, an awful event from Israel's perspective in 167 BC, which was the defiling of the temple by this dude. His name was Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And it was very clear that this language was being used to interpret theologically a historical event at the time. Jesus does the exact same thing in the Gospels.
Yeah. That's brings me to another question. That wording, like these events will happen, will be worse than what's ever happened before, and will ever happen again. Is that then just more like maybe hyperbole or exaggeration for effect?
Do you guys know the REM? It's the end of the world as we know it.
The song?
Yep.
Yeah.
REM. It's the end of the. I'm going to sing it for you. It's the end of the world as we know it. That's it. That's just and REM was not trying to give a biblical theology here, but that is it in a nutshell. It's not the end of the physical world, period. It's the end of the world as we know it. That is what Jesus is saying with the language you just asked me about. And if you then ask, well, the end of what world? And what does the world look like after the end of that world? The answer is, until Jesus, you had an understanding of God's people that basically said Israel is supposed to live out at the same time the hopelessness of the world if it keeps going the way it's going, and the hope of the world if it learns that the solution to humanity's problems are in putting the other first and not self. Okay, so the way that worked out in the case of Israel was with an institutionality that we talked about earlier, highly centralized, highly top-down, an understanding of holiness that is based on ritual differentiations. This is holy, that is not. You can eat this, but not that. This day is holy, but not that one. And like I said before, Jesus blows all of that out of the water. And now you have none of that anymore. None of it. You don't have the Sabbath anymore. I don't need to go down the whole list again, right? So it's the end of the world as we know it. And that's what that text is about. And the disciples understood it and they hated it.
So if we're getting into specifics here, I know a lot of people will usually go to like 1 Thessalonians 4 and Matthew 24, where it's talking about like meeting him in the heavens and stuff like that, right? Gathering his elect, things like that. How do you deal with those verses that people bring up to you?
I'm telling you, it's a lot easier for me to deal with it than for those who hold a rapture theology, because it's clear that that kind of saying by Jesus comes straight out of Daniel 7. And so the meeting up in the air, that is Daniel 7. It's right there. But of course, in Daniel 7, it talks about Israel one day, if it does its job vis-a-vis humanity as a whole, one day being invited into the presence of God and being bestowed. There are like 4 words right there, Daniel 7:13, and give or take a verse. Read the whole whole chapter. It's a vision. By the way, it's a vision. I mean, if we needed another clue that this is not literal, this is metaphorical, for goodness sakes, it's a vision. It says that right there. So you look at that, and then Israel will be bestowed in God's presence, power, glory, and all the rest of it. And when Jesus uses that kind of language, and Paul for that matter, not as much as Jesus, but he does a few times, we have the same motif in First Thessalonians, as you mentioned. We have a little bit of it in Revelation too. But when Jesus, above all, uses that kind of language, is basically saying that which God promised to you, Israel, is being fulfilled now in me and in those who commit to me and who are okay with a world that succeeds the one that ended, which is
Very
now.
Yeah.
Which is now. The Bible is not interested in speculating about what happens to you when you're run over by a bus.
Yeah.
Christians seem, I want to say, I don't know if I'm overemphasizing anything here. I think not, but I want to say Christians are so interested in putting everything on that, either the personal eschatology, what happens when the bus runs you over, or some kind of world eschatology in the sense of the physical world will disappear, fireball, Second Peter, and so on. And meanwhile, God just says, oops, I made a mistake with creation. I'm going to evacuate you guys real quick and put you on another planet. And maybe Elon Musk can help with that. I mean, it's just... It's kind of a little nuts, but I can say that because I'm immersed in the first century world. So for me, it's hard to see people do this kind of stuff with a text.
Yeah. So with that then, because I've heard this teaching before, and I'm like, I have no problem like saying, yeah, that's true. That's reality. Let's go with truth. But I have been questioning in the last couple months what because we talked about how Thessalonians talks about the meeting him in the sky, and that goes to Daniel 7. Thessalonians also, if I remember correctly, that's why I grabbed the Bible. Doesn't it talk about the son of perdition, or the man of the abomination of desolation?
Yeah, and the abomination of desolation. The gentleman I mentioned earlier, Antiochus Epiphanes the Fourth.
Yeah.
Syrian dude in 167 BC. He, of course, at that time was the son of perdition and desolation, the abomination that's now sitting in the temple and so on, and who just walked in there with no regard for Jewish sensitivities based on their particular understanding of ritual holiness, and so on. And then you have in Revelation, you have 666, and it's Nero. So it's a pattern throughout history. There are going to be those characters.
Okay.
Right. Definitely. I remember the first time I started studying Methodist theology, and I was introduced to this idea of like meeting Christ in the sky, like more to welcome him and all that kind of stuff. And AD 70 with the fall of Jerusalem and all that kind of thing. I was like, wow, this is pretty crazy. So on this view, what would then be like the future for humanity? Like you said that the Bible obviously doesn't talk about it a lot, but there is still like talk here and there about the second coming of Christ and stuff like that. What do you interpret that to be?
Okay, so as far as second coming is concerned, if you go to Acts, and you have in Acts 1 that situation where the disciples kind of go nuts a little bit, and they vote that guy in to replace Judas because they're so committed to Jerusalem. Even Jesus said they shouldn't do that, and they somehow orchestrate that whole thing with no involvement by God whatsoever. In that chapter, when all that happens, and you read in the first 8 verses basically about what we call the ascension, that also has very strong Daniel 7 language, and it is therefore a visionary experience, just like in Daniel 7. It kind of stands to reason, or at the very least, if anyone wanted to say that we should take that literally as opposed to a vision, they have to explain that. Because basically the default position has to be this comes straight from Daniel 7. It's a visionary situation that the disciples are experiencing, just like Daniel, except that this has more fulfillment character and that has more predictive character. So what does this then mean? It means that right after that, when Pentecost happens and the outpouring of the Spirit, I would strongly suggest, if people want to use second coming language, which is not biblical language anyway, but if they want to use it, that's where it would make sense.
Very
Pentecost.
interesting.
And then Pentecost happens again in chapter 4, right? In Acts 4. And then it happens again when Peter getting pulled out there, like I said, kicking and screaming by the Spirit to meet Cornelius, and Peter wants to kind of give this big speech and be all like puffed up about it, and then God kind of cuts right across it, and the Spirit just falls on the dude, and Peter goes, oh, all right, then I guess that settles that. This is 10 and 11, right? Acts 10 and 11. There's a Pentecost happening right there. In 19, Paul says to people, hey, you haven't heard of the Spirit, so you haven't received the Spirit. Well, they received the Spirit. So lots and lots of comings. So if we want to use second coming language, that's the way to go about it. But I wouldn't literalize the language. Say it again.
The second coming would then be like the Holy Spirit coming upon humanity. The
presence, the presence of the risen Jesus in this world. And that is what the New Testament is super interested in. Now, if you were to ask me, but what about a literal end of the world, and how would that happen, and what happens after death, that's way above my pay grade for two reasons. One, the Bible doesn't go there unless we force it, which I'm not interested in. And two, and this is something that people maybe don't often think about so much. It's actually a two-part too. The worldview that is required by rapture theology and by these treatments of the text that I criticized so much already. That worldview is a Platonic worldview. Plato. Greece. It's an up and down worldview, and it's basically there's the up, there's the down, the transcendent, and the immanent with an A, not an I. And so we're here, and there's that. Now there are two major problems with it, and this is the two sides of the coin that I mentioned a minute ago. One is that view is absolutely not that a sort of Jewish creational Old Testament based view. It is not. It's the antithesis to that. It is essentially creation denying the Platonic view, which basically says, up there, everything's better. Grass is greener on the transcendent side. Okay, so that's one problem with it, whereas the Jewish view is much more, this is the earth and everything within it belongs to the Lord. That's a creational Old Testament based view. Now, the other piece is this. You guys and I and whoever's watching this have a major problem, which is actually a good problem to have. And that problem is, and this is what I meant when I said to you, about the pay grade. This is, if you want to ask me about the end of the world, it's way above my pay grade. Not only because the Bible doesn't go there, and the fireball stuff in Peter in 2 Peter is also not about that. But not only for that reason, but for the reason that the transcendent is by definition, not only, our view of it is not only based on Platonic philosophy rather than biblical philosophy, but it also necessitates an understanding that the transcendent is above our pay grade. It wouldn't be transcendent otherwise. That's the whole point of calling it transcendent, right? As opposed to imminent. So we say God is transcendent. Fine, I have a problem with that. But God is transcendent, and then we say, oh wait, no, he's not. I mean, yes, he is, but not really. Or we go something like this. We go, God is transcendent, but somehow, maybe through the Spirit or whatever, we can still understand God literally.
Very
What?
interesting, yeah.
There's something just went badly wrong. And the way some people then resolve it is they say, oh, the world as a whole cannot understand the transcendent, but we Christians can. And at that point, I'm kind of thinking, okay, right, let's just go and have a drink somewhere and move on to another conversation. Let's have a glass of milk. Sorry.
That's so funny.
Oh, you can have a drink if you want.
Well, I'm not going to tell you what I have here.
So for people that are listening to this, I know it's like it can be a shock because so many Christians, especially evangelicals, dispensationalists, it's such a forward looking view of we're in the church, we're looking forward to the day Christ comes back, and the rapture happens. Hopefully it's pre-trib, so we don't go through the tribulation, and we're exactly waiting to get to this this kind of place where we can be raptured out of this whole thing, trying to get out of this life, like you said, the very Platonistic view, right? So it can be a shock to a lot of people to encounter this kind of information. What do you think someone that kind of has that shock, they might be in a kind of place well, what do I do with my life now? This is the thing I was going towards of trying to do a good job following what the Bible told me to do until this event happens. That's what I thought was going to happen. Now maybe it's not. I got to go relook at the scriptures. What do I base my life around again? What would you say to that kind of person that's trying to figure that out?
I think the first thing I would say to that kind of person is that they need to give themselves time to deal with this and not force themselves to just make some kind of rupture or, concluding I can't make that rupture. I'm just going to stick with what I have, the hell with it. That was intentional. The hell with it. And I would say, no, don't do that. I would say give yourself time, because this frame of thinking, even though it's not widespread in the world as such, it's actually kind of like McDonald's. It even though it came, from England and Ireland originally, it is mostly an American thing. And wherever Americans have gone in the world, in Germany, you don't find much of this. Hardly any countries where you find much of this, except where Americans went. It's the McDonaldization of theology. Now, if you are such a theological devotee to what I just call metaphorically McDonald's rapture theology, if you are that kind of person, then that's a very big deal for you. You are a narrative being. You will not be able, nobody will be able to just walk away from something in a healthy way, just like that, and say, oh, cool. That's not going to happen. Right. So I'm really always telling people, take time. And it doesn't matter whether you take a year or whether you take 5 years. And you know what? I still get emails sometimes from people who say, hey, you taught me 18 years ago or whatever. You probably don't remember me. And maybe I do, or maybe I don't. But you said something, and I've been thinking about that most days, for the last 18 years. And I think I'm getting what you're saying. Now that to me is cool. That's much cooler than if somebody says, in a lecture a week later, I just changed everything. What you said makes so much sense. And I can see it in the Bible now without having to sort of twist it or whatever. So that's the first thing I would say. You really need time. And the second thing I would say is, don't start with theology. Don't start with conclusions. There's something that is prior to theology. Theology is not prior. There's something that is prior to theology, and I'll tell you in a minute what it is. And by prior, I mean there's something that is so fundamentally human that you cannot walk away from it. But you can walk away from theology, no problem. The fact that you can walk away from theology itself shows it's not prior. What is prior? The need to interpret. We cannot not interpret as humans. It's impossible. Try and turn your brain off for 1 second. You cannot do it. Not at night, not during the day, not in Honolulu, not in Minneapolis. You can never do it until you breathe your last. So hermeneutics, how to interpret stuff, is fundamentally part of the creational scene that God came up with. Start there. Do not start with this theological view or that theological view. I started this thing called Warehouse Theology, and it's all predicated on helping people, in one sense, get back to basics, get back to being human interpreters, learn how to interpret properly. And then you come to your own, then you can see stuff. You come to your own conclusions, not in the sense that you can just come up with whatever and people say, huh, cool. I may not believe that, but you do, or whatever. Not in that sense, even though that may be part of it, but in the sense of you then, as an improved interpreter, will come to the Bible and you will say, huh, I'm discovering something here that, Thorsten Moritz or Tom Wright or someone like that has, I've heard them say this kind of stuff. And now I can see it. I actually just looked at the text and I thought, wow, I don't need to mess around with the text. I don't need to dissect it into individual verses or sentences or clauses or words or prepositions that form parts of words. I don't need to blow the building up to pretend to understand it. I can actually walk in and around and I see, oh, that's what this building is. So those are the things that where I would start in answer to your question for people like that.
Very interesting. Wow. That's awesome.
Yeah. So I know a lot of people who hold the idea that we'll be raptured and we'll leave. I think like what you believe about that influences a lot of like how you live your life, right?
Yes.
Like a lot of people
Definitely
will justify not recycling or not taking care of the world because of like, God's gonna come back and it's all gonna be destroyed anyways. I don't have any personal responsibility.
Even if not like directly, even just subconsciously, a lot too.
Which they still have problems with because the Bible commands us to steward the world well, right? It's like God's garden, He put us in it, so we should take care of it. So they still have a problem there. But with the idea that, okay, the rapture is not going to happen, I don't have to have this existential crisis. If it's going to happen in my life, I can live my life knowing that, hardships will come, but I will, unless something crazy happens, probably live my life until old age and then pass away and whatnot. Obviously we do share the gospel when we do that. What is the focus of the Christian life that they should be pursuing, in your opinion, outside of evangelism and discipleship?
Evangelism, discipleship, those are must be parts of a bigger vision rather than something that gets subcontracted. Like a church says, we support this missionary somewhere, and hey, missionaries deserve supporting, don't get me wrong, but we dissect everything, and I think that's kind of tragic, because then you lose that thing that you're asking me for right now, which is to live out a humanity worth having. That's it. To live out a meaningful humanity. You see, what the Old Testament, I mean, think Moses, think Deuteronomy, think Exodus, and so on. Think that time and how God sort of implored and helped Israel in some ways design a humanity that is institutional, and it is based on ritual understandings of holiness as opposed to relational understandings of holiness. That was never supposed to be the last word. That was supposed to be part of that was supposed to be the journey towards the kind of humanity that actually takes us to Eden. It takes us to before the apple, and that's the vision of the Bible. This is why John's gospel starts much like Genesis started, for instance. I could give you plenty of other examples, but it's about recovering the original vision, the divine vision for a humanity that is worth having. And that is a relational humanity. That means that holiness is now defined relationally. The clearest example of this, to my mind, and there's many dozens and dozens and dozens of examples just in the Gospels, but the clearest one to my mind is something like Mark 7, for instance, where Jesus again gets criticized by the Pharisees. Why? Because they're stuck in the ritualistic understanding of holiness, and he wants to move them to a relational one, and they have zero interest in that. So when they have another go at him, and he, of course, sticks with the relational, he says, it's not what you put into your mouth that's the problem, it's what comes out. And bam, there you have the redefining of holiness, of a life worth living, basically, in relational terms as opposed to ritual terms. No sacred space, no sacred times, no sacred offices, no sacred rituals, no sacred pilgrimages. I can't talk. It's all gone. I'm not saying it's bad when people do that. I don't. I have friends who are, they have sort of monastic tendencies and so on. Okay, that's not my thing, but good for you. I'm just saying. I hope that if someone does that, that they don't elevate that as the thing that follows after the end of the world as we know it.
Yeah. So when what can you define what you mean by no sacred offices? Because I know that there's not like the priest that like directly communicates with God on behalf of the people like we have in the Old Testament, but we do have like Ephesians 4 talks about like the fivefold ministry, right? Where it's like they have a priest, prophet, evangelist, teacher, preacher, or not priest, but apostle.
Ephesians 4 talks about ministry. I don't think so.
Was it not Ephesians 4? Or
it is Ephesians 4. You got the right text. You got the right text, all right. You're looking at verses 11 and 12, right? Which, by the way, is right after one of those.
That's a goal to pursue, just to know the scriptures like that right off the
bat. Well, you know what's so intriguing? Well, my PhD was on Ephesians, as it happens, but not on that particular piece. But though I do have a chapter in a book on the few those interesting few verses just before what you were quoting here, when it talks about up and down. And anyway, I don't want to take us too far afield, but there's that up and down metaphor again with Moses going up the hill, in Psalm 68, 18, and then in Ephesians, you have to wonder how does this connect to Pentecost, because Jesus is coming, quote unquote, down again through the Spirit and so on. You have that right before what you're talking about. And when you look at that, and my chapter on that, I haven't read it in many years. I can't read my own stuff. It's too hard. I just can't. And Amazon has the book for $279 or something. So way to go. but anyway, I do remember distinctly when I wrote that, and when I read that text ever since, that it's a gifts text. It explicitly says he came to give gifts. So what we have in the verse that you're talking about is gifts. Okay. If you want to turn that into offices and use ministry language, I'm not having a go at you. I
don't think so.
You as being just in general, right?
Oh, yeah,
if you want to do that, then I don't know. Did you guys watch by chance that Ferrari video that I did?
I did, yeah.
I haven't been able to had a chance.
Okay, in that video, I'm saying 3 people get a Ferrari. They do very different things with it. One takes it apart and doesn't have a Ferrari anymore, but has a fantastic workshop. That's like the theological scholar, and that used to have a Bible. One is an artist who takes the Ferrari and runs a plasma cutter through it and creates fantastic art and puts it on a pole. He also doesn't have anything to drive anymore, which is fine because he already has a Volvo. And then there's this woman. There's this woman who actually drives the Ferrari, and she bangs it up a little bit. But the main thing is she's got wind in her hair. She's interpreting the Ferrari. She's actually driving it. So what I would say to you, back to Ephesians 4, If
Yeah.
you want to take the gifts passages like that and turn them into office and ministry type stuff, you're like the artist. You're not like the woman. And as I'm looking at you, you may not care very much about having wind in your hair, but
Hey, you're not wrong. It's so good.
but you know,
I
the
will say I never
artist.
have a bad hair day.
Exactly. So the artist creates something really, really cool, but he's creating a new thing, and he has to sign responsible for that. If you take Ephesians 4 and you make it about ministry and offices, and by the way, people who do that, they frequently just take the bits they like, okay, and then they turn them into
you see a lot of that with like prophets, right? It's like, I am prophet.
Oh yeah,
and
then it's only one, because you want a senior pastor, right? Too bad that in Ephesians these things are plural because they're gifts. No worries. We'll turn it into offices. We'll turn it into singular. We pretend that Jesus didn't do away with that other humanity, and we're good. So if you wanted to do that, you'd be like that artist. Now, I might like the dude's art, but I may not like the fact that there is no Ferrari to be borrowed and driven.
So then the gifts in that sense would be given for the edification of humanity going forward, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if you have an understanding, of church, and I think a very good book, the guy doesn't actually approach it as a New Testament scholar or not super theologically, but I think it's really good, is something by Robert Banks. It's called Paul's Idea of Community. And I think he's, most of the time, he's right on this. And he shows that in New Testament times, it was clearly, the understanding of church was clearly one that was organic, and it was utterly decentralized, and it was not office-driven. It was not top-down institutional. Now, if you want a community that you call it church or not, we could talk about the word ecclesia if you wanted to, but maybe not this exact minute or second. But if you want a humanity called church that reflects those values, those relational values that Jesus was about, you cannot have, and I'm not being judgmental here, I'm just saying, show me, the senior pastors out there, and I've taught thousands, and of course they've taken issue with me on this, and I always say, well then show me where I'm going wrong here, and show me that from scripture, because you claim to be scriptural. Ephesians 4, it's always Ephesians 4, there's nothing else, and even Ephesians 4 doesn't work. But then show me for this, sorry, that was direct. Again, no critique of you, but show me from the text that the humanity worth having in light of Jesus, and Paul, a brilliant interpreter of Jesus, as opposed to the 12, then show me how you can do that if you have 100 people or 1,000 people or 10,000 people in that church. You cannot, because now you have to manage that humanity. Right. And now it's back to the world as we knew it.
Yeah.
It's no longer the end of the world as we knew it.
Yeah, and I do think I feel like what you're hinting at with the idea of church is like you said, decentralized, not institutionalized. So in my mind, I think I'm initially about like a house church or Bible study or a community group, close friends that you have where you guys gather together and have that relational, seeking God together, right?
And then you need the gifts plural. Then you need the gifts plural for Ephesians 4, and you can turn them into singulars, and you can turn them into offices, and you can turn them into top-down management.
Yeah, and then it becomes more about everyone's participating and giving, so everyone feels included. And because like what you said with institution, or you didn't say this, but in institutions, what you have is like one person, like the pastor, using his gift, the worship leaders doing their thing, being really good at that. And then the service team may be doing stuff, but then like everyone else who's in a congregation is just kind of sitting, receiving, and not participating.
You know, there's an interesting. Well, I find it interesting because I kind of sort of dreamed it up one day in conversation in class, but an interesting test that churches could do. I want you to imagine a non-Christian person who understands rightly, and profoundly from the New Testament that Jesus died as Ephesians. Oh, here's Ephesians again, this time chapter 2. Which says explicitly, Jesus died to create a new humanity, not a new man. Translations that say a new man, they just have no idea what the chapter is doing. It's a new humanity. The whole chapter is about humanity, not a new man. But anyway, that individualization is one of those sort of crazy things that we do sometimes, and we shouldn't. Anyway, so here's this non-Christian person who has a profound understanding. Maybe they studied religion or theology. I've had many students in universities in various countries who were not Christians, but they were great theology students, have profound understanding that the church is supposed to be about quote unquote advertising, or if you don't like that word, demonstrating to the world a way of being human that will help the world live with meaning.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Live meaningfully. Okay, so here's this person, this non-Christian person, who understands that and says, it's Sunday morning. Isn't that when these Christians meet? And isn't that when they put on this particular sort of showcase of the sort of humanity that Jesus died to create? Maybe I should ignore the fact that going in there, someone's going to come up to me and be all smiles and how lovely that you're visiting. I'm not making fun of anything, but it's daunting if you're not part of that kind of thing, that you walk into the managed humanity and already at the door you're kind of being very friendly and very honestly being managed. You walk in there. So this person walks in there and says, okay, I'm so curious what this new humanity looks like that Jesus died to create. And then you're maybe shown by an usher to a row or not, whatever. And you sit down and there's this thing where everybody looks up front. And then there are people, very few people, maybe they're usually just one at a time, except if it's the worship band that you mentioned earlier or something, looking the other way and kind of broadcasting at the many. This person, this non-Christian person, is going to be extremely confused, and rightly so. The end.
Wow, really interesting. That's awesome. I feel like I could sit here and listen to you talk about all this for like 10 more hours. It's awesome.
We could cover and go into every which way and topic that we can think of, but this has been great.
Yeah. Do you have anything else you want to say on the topic before we close it up?
Anything else I want to say on what topic you said?
The rapture of the church, anything we've been talking about so far. Anything else?
Oh, the rapture. No, I think we covered most of it. The one thing I want to say though is that there's also a convenience factor, and convenience not being a great thing here, which is with the kind of rapture theology that we talked about that does not come from the Bible, that does not make worldviewish sense. That is just plain wrong. And if people are waiting for that, then they will wait a long time. We have already waited 2,000 years, apparently. And that doesn't seem to face people. Every generation thinks it's still happening during their generation. Whatever, I don't have to personally worry about that. But with that kind of theology, there's a convenience factor that people need to be aware of and they need to question, which is, if that's the theology you're going for, isn't it convenient that it seems to absolve you from social responsibility now?
Yeah.
Which is a function of a relational understanding of holiness. It's not what goes into the mouth that's the issue. It's what comes out, Mark 7. That would be my question.
Wow, that's awesome. Very profound.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks so much for coming on. We really, really enjoyed it. I'm sure we'll ask you to come on a million more times, just if you want to or not. But we really enjoyed our conversation.
How far are you from the beach?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, yeah.
10 minutes what? Driving or walking?
Yeah,
Driving.
40-minute walk.
Yeah, 3-mile walk. Yeah.
I'll still take that. We should do one of these at your because I go to
absolutely
Hawaii occasionally. So yeah.
Yeah. I'd love to make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We had a great time.
Well, thank you guys. Thanks for doing the podcast. That's amazing.
Of course, we want to be here as a outlet for people to find good answers, integral answers, and honest answers, or as best we can get the answer to hard questions. And there's a lot of gray areas, and humanity and Christianity is messy, and it's not this perfect, clean, set up thing that a lot of people maybe have been led to believe in the past.
It's easier for it to be that way, right?
Yeah, it's easier, but life is messy, and God knows it, and God's not intimidated by it, and He's here to love those who are questioning, and so are we.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it too. Please rate it, subscribe, all the things you want to do. We love you, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. See ya.
See you guys. Thank you.